So welcome all to this ChemSec webinar. We are very glad to see all of you joining this afternoon. So the chemical strategy for sustainability presented by the EU Commission last fall acknowledged the urgency to speak up the phase out of hazardous chemicals. And one important part in this strategy is, in our view, the proposal to introduce the concept of essential use, to allow for the most harmful chemicals only when the use is essential. This webinar is about the essential use concept. We will walk you through how it all started, ChemSec's view of the concept and how to apply it, as well as other parties' input to the discussion and a bit of insights on the process moving forward. My name is Frida Höök. I'm the Deputy Director of ChemSec. With me at this webinar, I have my colleagues, Dr. Anna Lennqvist and Peter Perrault. And I will soon leave the floor to Anna to walk us through how it all started and ChemSec's view on the essential use issue. And Peter will take care of the technical part of this meeting, as well as manage the Q&A part at the end. So if you have questions or reflections, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom page and write your questions. And we will try to reply to them during the session or at the end of the webinar when we have some dedicated time for discussions and questions and reflections. This webinar will be recorded. So after the meeting, we'll send out a link to the recording, and we will also include the slides. So they will be provided to you very soon after the meeting or after the webinar. Great. So before giving the floor to Anna, I will start with a brief introduction of our organization. So ChemSec is an environmental NGO funded in 2002. We are based in Sweden and committed to the development of sustainable chemicals and the phase out of substance of concern. We do this through constructive dialogues and discussions with companies using and producing chemicals and by highlighting good examples. We put forward solutions that are not only beneficial for human health and the environment, but also good for future-proof companies. We develop practical tools to facilitate for companies to have an ambitious chemical management. Peter, we can take the next slide. Yes, so I put down our tools that we provide for free online here. So you can, if you're interested, have a look at them later on. You find them on our website. And the aim with the tools is both to facilitate for companies, as I said, to have a progressive, ambitious chemicals management. It also is to help companies prioritizing chemicals for substitution, as well as to find alternatives. So we collaborate and help companies with phasing out hazardous chemicals, but we also work with investors, providing them with analytical tools to evaluate and reduce investment related to hazardous chemicals. And last but not least, we're also deeply engaged in the EU chemicals policy discussions. We have during the years focused a lot on the implementation of REACH, and now we follow the implementation of the chemical strategy with a lot of interest and focus. Our funding comes from governments and charity foundations, which enable us to keep our integrity. So we specialize in the area of chemicals and are inspired by our dialogue with progressive brands, many working hard to phase out substance of concern. And at this webinar, we will not focus, we can take the next slide, Peter. We will not focus on what is essential use, but instead on when is it justified to use hazardous chemicals, as the headline of this webinar indicated, since we think that this is a more appropriate question, and we will come back to why later on. The concept of essential use is definitely a policy issue, but also very important to many companies. A clear and strict definition, criteria, and implementation of the essential use concept is important to give industry clarity. It will also support the many companies working hard to phase out substance of concern from their products. And it will make life easier for them, and it will spur innovation more efficiently. So I will now leave to my colleague, Dr. Anna Lenquist, to dig more into this question. When is it justified to use hazardous chemicals?
Thank you very much, Frida. Yes, I will give an introduction to the concept of essential use and where it comes from and the background, and also our ideas of how we think that this can be put to function to be efficient. And then I will hand back to Frida, who will talk more about how the process is looking forward and the policy process and what different stakeholders say on the issue. But first of all, why do we need this new concept? Peter, you can take the next slide. So the blunt answer to this is that we still have main problems with hazardous chemicals. And I just listed some facts from different reports here to show the magnitude of the problem. So we have a chemicals industry that is growing, both in money and in terms of the amount of chemicals produced, which are more than 100,000 on the market, and the pure tonnage of these chemicals. And we also know that in the European Union, 62% in volume of the chemicals produced are classified as being hazardous to human health. We also find a growing number of hazardous chemicals in the blood and in the tissue of all of us. And science can increasingly link this exposure to different health disorders, such as reduced fertility, different cancers, and many other health issues. And this figure I put here on the side is from the Global Chemicals Outlook and from the beginning from the WHO. And they looked in 2016 on the deaths worldwide related to hazardous chemicals, which was 1.6 million, and divided them into the different diseases that caused the death. So it is a problem of magnitude, and the current regulation has not managed to improve this, unfortunately. We also know, and this is a bit of a new area, but there is more and more evidence that can link chemical pollution also to other environmental issues, such as climate change and biodiversity loss, for example. Of course, it's all linked, and it makes sense that it is that way. And in a questionnaire a year ago or something, 84% of the European citizens said that they are worried about the impact of hazardous chemicals on human health. And 90% were worried about the impact of chemicals on the environment. And we can take the next slide. So a specific chemical problem that has been discussed much lately, and that has also been the background problem for launching the need for the essential use concept, is the so-called PFAS, also called forever chemicals. And this is a huge group, about more than 5,000 molecules. There are different figures circulating, but something like this. And the common problem of all of these is that they are very persistent in the environment. So it means that they do not degrade when put out there, but they can remain in the environment for hundreds and even thousands of years in some cases. And they have been used the last decades very, very widely, in everything from dental floss to food packaging to frying pans to tents to firefighting foams. And today we find versions of these chemicals in all of us, in all of our bloods, and also all over the globe, even in remote areas such as the polar areas and so forth. They are spread. And also these ones are increasingly linked to different health disorders, different cancers, and to something that is very relevant now is the immune system, and that they may reduce the effect of vaccines, for example. So it is a problem that is getting increasingly attention. And right now there is a number of different legal cases around the globe, because more and more citizens are realizing that they have been polluted and they have these chemicals in the blood. And in some cases they have tried to sue someone for this. And the problem here is also who to blame. Is it the one that are providing the drinking water, the water companies? Is it the companies that have had some activity that has released these chemicals into the water? Or should it be the chemical companies that produce these chemicals in the first place, often knowing that they are quite problematic? This is not yet clear. And the essential use concept is an attempt to address this such uncontrolled and very widespread use of very problematical chemicals that we cannot take back, that we cannot regret? How can we assure that we don't end up there again, or that we make it even worse? So the next slide. The essential use concept was first raised by scientists looking into exactly these PFAS chemicals. And in 2014, there was a meeting resulting in a publication in 2015 called the Madrid Statement. And there, more than 250 scientists from 38 countries signed on the urgency to really do something about PFAS and to do something different. And one of the proposals there was to introduce the essential use concept for PFAS chemicals. And in 2019, there was another scientific publication by Cousins et al., who elaborated how we could use the so-called Montreal Protocol on PFAS chemicals. And the Montreal Protocol is, since 1987, a global agreement to minimize the use of ozone depleting compounds to only essential uses. And the idea is to use the same concept then for PFAS. And in this publication from 2019, they outline 3 different categories that are in line with the Montreal Protocol. So to say that the first category of uses is so-called non-essential. The second one is category 2 is substitutable uses. And the third one is what you can call essential. Then in 2020, 5 different member states jointly announced that they will prepare a restriction proposal to restrict all PFAS in all uses, in all but essential uses in the European Union. This is a huge proposal and the work is still ongoing. And finally, what really made this sort of very timely and very much on the spot was the acknowledgement in the chemical strategy from the Commission last autumn that the essential use concept is needed and will be used, and not only for PFAS, but for so-called the most harmful chemicals. And Peter, you can take the next slide. And this is the exact text from the chemical strategy. So it says that the chemical strategy will ensure that the most harmful chemicals are only allowed if their use is necessary for health, safety, or is critical for the functioning of society, and if there are no alternatives available from the standpoint of environment and health. We can take the next one. So at ChemSec, we very much welcome this development, and we see it as a game changer and compared to existing regulation, because it clarifies very much that the most harmful chemicals are not acceptable. And if they are to be used, this is to be a very limited and very justified uses. And we hope that this will be a more efficient process in regulating chemicals. We hope that this process will be set up so that we can avoid what we call analysis by paralysis. Paralysis by analysis, I mean. And this means that regulators have had a tendency that when there is an uncertainty about a chemical, to ask for more data rather than to take a decision on the data we have. And this has delayed processes very much. And we hope that it will be different with the essential use concept, and that the precautionary principle can be used when there is uncertainty. We also like that it's very clear that the aim is the protection of human health and the environment, and that thereby financial arguments are not valid in this context. And we think that this also provides an incentive for innovation of safe and sustainable chemicals, and it clarifies that safe and sustainable chemicals are not chemicals with intrinsic hazardous properties or the most harmful ones. And we can take the next slide. So some month ago, similar, we put up a paper where we tried to identify and outline how we see that this process can work. Because we have been in different meetings and different webinars like this when the issue has been discussed. And a first impression from those meetings is that when you just put the question, what is essential, you can get any answer. You can get everything from peace on earth to stain repellents on sofas. And somehow we need to sort of take this huge philosophical question down to something not philosophical, but to a political issue. And instead, as Frida said, instead of asking the question, what products are essential, or even try to sort of compare products to each other and say that this is important and this is not important. It's not about the importance of products, but it is about in what cases can we accept really hazardous chemicals? When can it be justified to use them? So we can take the next slide. And we think there are a few things that we need to keep in mind to not, again, as I said, get lost in this philosophical strange discussions that doesn't really lead to the target here. And we see that one important thing to get efficiency into the process is that we cannot evaluate every case by case, because the committees and the system will be flooded. Instead, we have to establish a semi-automatic methodology that decide up front what uses can even be considered essential and can even be considered for being discussed in expert committees, and filter out the other ones to focus on the important ones. And again, we will repeat this many times because I think it's really important. It is not about saying that one product is important and one is not, but it is about when is it justified to use really hazardous chemicals. And we can take the next one. So this looks complex, but we try to make it rather easy. So it's a stepwise approach for filtering out cases that are not needed to be discussed, that could not even be essential, so to say. And that this should be an upfront process that does not need the involvement of expert committees or similar. So in the first step here, we have listed uses that we don't consider essential. And that is products that are used for luxury, convenience, leisure, cosmetics, for example, where we cannot see a reason to why these are essential or why these are necessary for health, environment, or functional society. In the next step, we have different products that are important and then they may be necessary because we need clothes, we need food packaging, we need furniture, we need houses, and so forth. But we also see that for all of these products listed, there are alternatives without hazardous chemicals. And more importantly, we don't want hazardous chemicals in our clothes or in our food packages or in our personal hygiene products. So therefore, we regard them as non-essential too. In the next step are categories that may include products that are essential or are necessary for health, environment, or functioning of society. And these are, for example, medical devices, products related to energy production, transport, military uses, and sometimes communication. It does not mean that all products in those categories are necessarily essential, but this needs to be decided in the next step. And in the last step, there needs to be a careful scrutiny if there are alternatives available that can fulfill the same function as this product or as this chemical in this product. And first then, if sort of all of these steps are passed, then we can take the time and resources needed for a thorough discussion in an expert committee. And by that, I hand over to Frida to talk about how the process is to move forward from here and how it looks.
Great, thanks, Anna. And we can take the next slide, Peter. Great. So I will just repeat what Anna said, because the strategy, the chemical strategy for sustainability made clear that essential use will play an important role in future of chemicals regulation to ensure that the most harmful chemicals are only allowed if their use is necessary for health, safety, or is critical for the functioning of society, and if there are no alternatives available from the standpoint of environment and health. Yes, so we can take the next slide. So a bit about the process. According to the timed list of actions attached to the strategy, the criteria for essential use should be defined by the Commission in the period of this or next year. And prior to the launch of the chemical strategy, actually both council conclusions as well as a resolution from the European Parliament have clearly supported the inclusion of the concept of essential use in EU chemicals regulation to make the regulation more efficient. And to start the process of defining criteria, the Commission published a first paper, an information note as it was called, on the essential use concept to CARRI. And CARRI is the Commission meeting for REACH, where member states as well as stakeholders take part. In this paper, the Commission made a comparison between the essential use concept and the REACH process, specifically the authorization process. And talking about just moving into the authorization process a bit, the socioeconomic analysis performed within the authorization process is limited and are not, as implemented now, an efficient tool to phase out the most harmful substances. And the Commission states in its paper that discussion have been held whether the use of the most hazardous or persistent substances should not be further restricted to uses with a high societal value. In other words, essential use. And further on, the Commission highlights the experience gained during the preparation of REACH restriction dossiers, which has demonstrated that it's often very difficult for authorities to obtain specific and reliable information, for example, on the cost and benefits of each use at the necessary level of detail. And this makes it very difficult to assess the need and the right level of legislative action to be taken. And the absence of robust and reliable data makes the process both more time-consuming and requires more time and resources from public authorities to develop and process dossiers. And here, the concept of essential use could make the process more efficient. In addition to a more efficient process, the Commission lists predictability for industry, as well as a more efficient regulation as benefits of introducing the concept of essential use. And member states were invited to express their views on the information note and reply to a number of specific questions raised by the Commission in the paper. And we can take the next slide, Peter. And the views from the member states varied from very positive to more cautious, not too surprisingly, of course. And issues raised by member states was, for example, the difficulty to make a generic list of essential uses, since what is not essential today might be regarded as essential tomorrow. Some suggested to do case-by-case evaluations instead of a generic list. And as Anna said, at ChemSec, we believe a generic list would be more useful, would give industry greatest predictability and make the decisions more efficient. Case-by-case evaluations have shown to often mean never-ending discussions, more than clarity and efficiency. Some member states also highlighted the need to include many different stakeholders in the process, and that the process is both scientific, political, and in some way also philosophical. And in our view, the questions that should be asked is not what is essential use, since that can lead to discussion, as Anna said, about peace or food supplies. And that is not a very useful discussion in this context. So the right question to pose is, in our view, a political one. When is it justified to use hazardous chemicals? France stated, for example, in their reply to the Commission that the concept should speed up decisions to phase out the most hazardous substances, and the aim should be to find the right level of definition, criteria, or methodology to avoid never-ending discussions. If this is not achieved, France really questioned the relevance of using the concept altogether. So it should not add more sort of work or more administrative burden. The idea with introducing the concept is to make the process more efficient. And looking at the replies from industry, industry is not surprisingly more cautious in their view on the efficiency of introducing the essential use concept. Many industry organizations also highlight the difficulty but the importance of defining criteria, especially since the definition of what is essential might differ over time and in different cultures. CEFIC clearly states that some specific chemicals might be needed to fulfill the aims of climate neutrality, as well as the transition to circular economy, and these uses should be regarded as essential. And we, of course, understand industry's caution, since it's their product that will be labeled essential or non-essential in the end. So we therefore believe that a generic list of essential and non-essential products really gives industry clarity and an indication if they need to start to work on substitution or not. Euromethod would like the concept to have a risk-based approach, something we do not agree to. The aim with the essential use is to phase out substance of concern where the use is not necessary, and to introduce a generic approach to risk management, which means focus on the intrinsic hazard properties of the chemical in question and not on risk calculations. So overall, both member states and industry request further clarity on how the concept should be integrated into regulation. And I mean, that's where we are in the process. That is not clear yet. This is all up for this discussion now. And in a reply from the Commission to all these comments from member states and stakeholders, the Commission highlights also the complexity of introducing the concept and make clear that further in-depth work is needed before they will propose criteria to define essential use. And moreover, the Commission has also made clear that essential use will be included in the revised REACH regulation. But the idea with the essential use concept, it should be used broader than REACH and in other relevant EU legislations. And in comments for the inception impact assessment on REACH that closed just a few weeks ago, a number of member states made clear that they support to strengthen the authorization process by introducing the essential use concept into this process. And they do not support to take authorization part out of REACH as indicated in the inception impact assessment. So Peter, we can take the next slide. So what happens now? So Commission is working on a supporting study. The Commission is also expected to develop a working paper and organize a workshop where the concept and possible criteria will be discussed. And this should probably happen in the coming months. And as I said before, the Commission is expected to present an initiative where they propose criteria for essential use late 2021 or in 2022. And the public consultation on REACH, where essential use will also be included, is planned to start late 2021 and run for a few months. And we can take the next slide. Yes, so to summarize, before we sort of give you the floor and hope you have a lot of questions and reflections on what we have said, I just want to again raise what we see as the most important points, the keys for efficiency here. So we see that limited cases that need to be discussed in expert committees is crucial to avoid case-by-case evaluation through generic list that will give predictability and also spare public resources. And then focus on when it's justified to use hazardous chemicals and try to avoid the more philosophical question. And with that, I think we are ready to move into the Q&A session, and I leave the floor to you, Peter.
Thank you, Frida. Yes, many questions. This is obviously a topic that many people are interested in. So I think first there's a couple of questions that are kind of similar, that it's about how we define a harmful substance. Are CMR substances in focus, or is it more broadly? Or is it only substances that are in the authorization process? Yeah, how do we define a hazardous chemical, really?
Anna?
I'll go with that one.
Yes,
Anna.
I can try to answer. Do you see me?
Yes.
Maybe not
Yes,
so
we
important.
see
Okay,
you.
I don't see myself, so I got confused. And you see me and you hear me. Okay. So to my understanding, there is no definition in the chemical strategy exactly what this is. It's mentioned in different instances that this should be CMRs, PBTs, EDCs, and also other types of properties like neurotoxicants and immunotoxicants. And for all of these, there are not yet official classifications in place, but that is another part of the chemical strategy to develop that. And there is also there are many parallel discussions ongoing here. There's also another parallel discussion on what defines a safe and sustainable chemical. And there is sort of this gradient, I would say, between what we would call substances of very high concern and fulfilling those criteria, which are also like substances on our SIN list, which are CMRs, PBTs, and also equivalent level of concern, and PMTs and EDCs. Then we have what is safe, and then there is something in between. And what the Commission will define as the most hazardous ones, we actually don't know. If this is equivalent to SVHCs, which I think makes much sense, or if it's broader, or if it's even more narrow, I think that remains to be defined.
Can you say a little bit about what we think, the ChemSec opinion?
Yes. I would say that we think that it should be equivalent to substances of very high concern.
Okay, so REACH criteria, basically.
REACH criteria.
Yeah.
If I can add there, I think in our view, we think that what are officially defined as substances of very high concern is a very limited list. So we would, of course, think that this needed to be all substances that are equivalent to the substance of very high concern. So the ones on the ChemSec SIN list, of course, at least.
Exactly.
But we also hope, so we also hope to broaden this scope. And I think the chemical strategy opens up to actually identify more substances, both in the official classification, but also for substance of concern being a more wider sort of part of the chemical universe.
Could you, we have a couple of questions that is about who says what is essential. So could you elaborate on that a little bit? Who should define what is essential use, and when is society functioning? Someone says, I suppose construction of housing can be an example of essential use and an important function for society. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, Frida, please?
Yes, I mean, we think this is a political decision, really, because we think that if we need to pose the question, when is it justified to use hazardous chemicals? And of course, there are things in our society that we don't want to be left out, but we also know that there are alternatives. So for many product areas, there are actually products without these substances of concern. So why should we actually allow continued use of these substances of concern when it's not necessary? So therefore, we think that these sort of generic list gives clarity to industry to say that if you produce some luxury products, well, don't use the hazardous chemicals because that will not be allowed. That is not a priority product for, then it's not justified to use these hazardous products. But there might be cases, but these should be very limited. So if the use of PFAS is this big today, we think that essential use is this big.
Okay. What is the timeline for deciding on the definition for essential use, and which organization will be responsible for the final decision on the definition?
So that's the Commission, and the timeline is this or next year to define criteria.
Mm-hmm. Do you argue for stop of reuse and preparing for reuse of products that are not essential? I guess that it's about recycling.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we believe that same requirements should apply to recycled materials to virgin materials. I mean, even if we think recycling is super important to move into a circular economy and a circular future, we see that is an incentive to phase out the hazardous chemicals, because obviously we can't recycle products if they contain hazardous chemicals, because then we also recycle the problem. So get the chemicals out so that we can move into circularity. Sounds very easy. I know it's not that easy, but this is our sort of broad vision of the problem.
Yep. Do you consider persistent as a hazardous endpoint, Anna?
Yes. And there are also argumentations by scientists that persistence should be enough to regulate a chemical, because this has been such a huge problem with these persistent chemicals, not only PFAS, but also others that accumulate both in organisms, but also in waters, and that we cannot get rid of them. So we need definitely to be extra careful with those.
Do you know of any certification that proves that a chemical product is not harmful?
I mean, there are a number of eco-labeling schemes or certification schemes, and they have all different criteria depending on what product categories you look into. And some of them are very strict, some of them are more, in our view, more questionable on the chemical side. But definitely there are certifications to be used for a number of product categories that, for example, do not allow syn chemicals to be used in the products labeled.
Okay, and a question about PFAS. Are there any alternative chemicals available today that can be used as substitutes for PFAS? If so, what are these chemicals? And if not, how long do you think it will be before they are developed alternatives for PFAS?
Should I go, Anna?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, PFAS are used in so many different places. So I mean, it's amazing where you find PFAS. So in many, many uses, there are definitely alternatives. ChemSec, we have developed a tool called ChemSec Marketplace, where companies producing alternatives to hazardous chemicals can advertise their alternative products that are not hazardous. So we advise you to look into that, because you will find a lot of PFAS alternatives there. We also know that the commitment within the chemical strategy that PFAS should be phased out as a group in all consumer products and in all uses where it's not essential is a very clear signal to industry to develop alternatives. And this is what we mean with giving industry predictability, not just that you know that you need to phase something out, but also that there's a market opportunity to develop alternatives. So I think that we will see a constant rise of alternatives to PFAS in the coming years. But sometimes you sort of think that PFAS should be replaced by one chemical in all these applications. That will not be the case. So for textiles, you might find one alternative. For dental floss, you will find another. For all these different, you find different alternatives. You will not replace PFAS with one single better alternative.
Okay, back to the definition of what is essential and not. Could you give an example of a medical device that is not essential?
I think that, I mean, if you sort of take the sort of medical area or the health area and say that this is an essential area for our society, not all products within a hospital is essential. You can talk about your coffee mug, your pen, your paper, there are a lot of things that are not specifically life-saving, and those are not essential, even if they're used in the hospital. So I don't know if that was clear enough.
Yeah.
I think it's important then that whatever we define as essential use needs to be very narrow. So one example that has been discussed is professional clothing, because we know that in firefighting, there are still a lack of alternatives. I think there might be. But for firefighters under specific tough conditions, it has been necessary to use PFAS. But to say that PFAS are essential in professional clothing, and that would mean that also like a bus driver should have PFAS, and that's really not necessary. So we have to we have to narrow down it very much to make this useful.
Isn't it also that in many of these cases that we discussed, there are actually alternatives? There many times the chemical that we want to see replaced are used just because, you know, it's been used forever and nobody really thought about it. But it's perfectly possible to just replace it.
Absolutely. I mean, it could be both. Sometimes it's very sort of easy, and maybe you don't even know about that you have PFAS in the products you're just selling, or because it's there of someone asked for it at some point and it's still there or something like that. Yeah. In some issues, it's really very, very complicated to find alternatives, but that depends on, I mean, the performance you sort of want to achieve and what's required, or what you think are required from your consumers. So I think if you as a company decide that PFAS should be phased out, to start to have a constructive dialogue with your suppliers, well, I think you will be able to move forward. But substitution could be very easy, but also very, very complex.
Long question here. What does it mean to have no hazardous chemicals? Does that mean that they cannot be part of a production process at all? What if there are only residual amounts below any detection limits? Or will there be like a threshold level allowed? These are very important distinctions, this person thinks. For example, hazardous monomers and solvents used to make some polymers. They are reacted and may not be detectable in the final polymer, but they are used in the production process. How should we approach this situation?
I think the focus now is to look into the final products and start there. That's the most important to start. Not that it's not important in the workplaces, etc. But let's start with what's come sort of out from the factories and do the substitution from the final products. And Anna, I leave to you on the levels.
Yes, I mean, we can discuss levels, and I think that needs to be also done on a case by case if we find that something is really essential. But I think also an issue referring to like levels and unreacted monomers and so forth is that I think an important part of the essential use concept is really to look at the intrinsic hazardous properties and go from there, instead of saying that, instead of looking at risk management. Because, for example, in the case of very persistent chemicals, we can say that risk management has failed. It has not been possible to calculate the safety of a chemical because it has this long life, it ends up everywhere, it's simply impossible. And therefore we need to put a bigger emphasis on the intrinsic properties because we cannot handle where these may end up, and especially not in a circular economy.
How about trends? Do you see any differences or trends in the use of hazardous chemicals between different industries? For example, you know, pharmaceutical or medical devices, cosmetics, or consumer products. Are there any differences or trends that you can see there, Frida?
Oof, that's a good I think that hazardous chemicals are used anywhere, really. They are finding
maybe how they approach it, you know, the different companies.
Okay, so how they approach it. I think that some industry have sort of got the sort of wake-up call and are very active. Many parties are very active. So for textile industry, I think there are many parties very, very active in this process, and PFAS is a large issue for them. I think, for example, for the cosmetic industry, I'm hoping that they will get that wake-up call soon. My feeling is that they haven't really yet. Some, of course, but the business as such, the bigger brands, etc. And I think that's necessary because, yeah, they need to deal with a lot of issues.
Mm-hmm.
Peter,
Anna,
it's time to...
Yes, we just have so many questions. So I thought we will have maybe one or two more.
Okay.
Anna, do you want to add to that, or is that fine?
No, I just wanted to say that we are not working specifically on medical devices, and that's a very specific type of products, but there are other NGOs like Healthcare Without Harm doing that. But what we can see when it comes to REACH and industrial chemicals, I mean, the chemical strategy really sets a new standard and have very high commitments on really looking into hazardous chemicals, especially in all consumer products. So I think we will need to see a trend, or there needs to be a trend really soon.
Yeah. Okay, I think we will stop there. We have many questions that are still open. Sorry for that. We don't have time. We should almost arrange a webinar that is only ask us anything. Again, sorry for if we didn't have time to answer your question. We will have a look at them afterwards. You could always email us, ask questions. We get a lot of emails. You could follow us obviously on Twitter and LinkedIn and follow us there for more about essential use or chemicals in products, hazardous chemicals. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter where we advertise new webinars all the time. So thank you very much for joining today, and hope to see you soon again. Do you want to add something, Frida or Anna, or are you happy?
I just want to say that this is not this is a work in progress. So this is an ongoing discussion, and we don't have all the answers, and we hope that you will also engage in this important discussion.
Yes, and thanks a lot for joining, and looking forward to future discussions on this topic.
Thanks. Goodbye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Bye.